whether the question is outside or not. Like, we'll be.
Thank you. All right, everyone, welcome to the second session in the Masterclass series that will be running from April 23rd to May 2nd. The series has been curated by Nork and Ektan, and we are in the second session of Theme 1, the big picture overview of systems and complexity informed evaluation. So we heard from Michael Patton and Charmaine Patton earlier today, and now we're going with Emily Gates. So we're really excited about it. As you know, this Masterclass series is part of a broader systems thinking initiative, which is a collaboration with Ektan and Harvard with the support from Porticus. And we have 4 pillars to our work: systems research, systems investing, systems measurement, systems design and implementation. And today we're coming to you on the systems measurement pillar. Just as a reminder, if you are interested in earning a digital certificate that you can use on LinkedIn and other ways, please register for the sessions, complete the readings and the homework ahead of the sessions, participate in at least 7 out of the 14 sessions. You don't have to participate live. You can watch the recordings, but the short survey must be completed. Without completing that, we cannot know that you've completed the session. So if you would kindly do that. After each session, everybody asks, everything will be available. The recordings will be available. You'll get an automated email with the recordings and everything as well. The readings are available. The homework is available, and the survey will be available. And also you can connect to on ECD Connect, which my colleagues will share in the chat, to continue the conversation where you can ask questions, and our experts will jump in there and answer questions for you. The basic format of each masterclass, again, welcome introduction, the masterclass session, the dialogue, although in this session, the dialogue will be interspersed throughout the masterclass, and then a Q&A with all of you. All right, just as a reminder, please make sure you select everyone in the chat. If you want to chat, we encourage you to use the chat, to share freely, to, communicate there. But for questions, please, because there's so much happening in the chat, we'll lose track of it. So if you can please click on the Q&A and put in your questions in the Q&A. We'll have the option for you to be able to vote for questions. You can also comment on them as well. So just monitor the Q&A, and also if we may answer the questions there as well, so you can see answered questions. Finally, for Spanish translation, if you need, we want to give a big thank you to UNICEF LACRO for sponsoring the Spanish translation. You can click on the interpretation and click on Spanish. And warm welcome to our interpreters, Maria and Mitzi, as well. So thank you for that. All right, and so today, it's my pleasure to introduce you to our wonderful Masterclass series systems expert, Emily Gates, and our early childhood expert, Aisha Yousafzai. So just really, it's a pleasure to introduce you to both of them. Oh dear. Just give me one quick second. There we go. All right, so Emily Gates, she is an evaluation scholar, practitioner, and assistant professor at Boston College. Her scholarship explores how evaluation can help people and organizations understand the complexity of problems and influence systemic change, and a focus on systemic thinking, values, and equity. She's the co-author of the book, Evaluating and Valuing in Social Research, and co-editor of an issue of New Directions for Evaluation, which features international cases of systems and complexity-informed evaluation. In 2023, Emily has received an early career award-winning name, naming her a promising new evaluator from the American Evaluation Association. So we're so honored, Emily, to have you with us today. And finally, I don't think Aisha needs any introduction. I think everybody in the early childhood world knows Aisha. But Aisha is, apologies. Aisha is a specialist in child development health, especially. Her research focuses on developing new interventions and approaches to promote early childhood development focusing on how to strengthen child and caregiving related outcomes through existing health, nutrition, and education systems. And she's currently a professor at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. So over to you, Emily and Aisha.
Great, thank you for that warm welcome. And thank you for everyone for joining from wherever you are and whatever time zone you're in, what dedication. It's an honor to be here and to talk with you a little bit about systems and complexity informed evaluation. So the big goal for this session is to transition from the opening to think about how do you bring some of these ideas and make methods choices in the context of evaluating an intervention, whether that intervention is designed to change a system or not. Shekufe already introduced a little bit more about me, but yes, this is sort of my why, my focus of my work. I am an evaluator, but I think a lot about the role of complexity and the issues that we try to address to advance change, and also how can we influence systems, both small and large scale. There are some links here to the references that Shekufe mentioned. I'm working on a current book project around evaluating system change. You can see it down there with a colleague, Pablo, in Spain. So this should be coming out later next year, and I'm going to draw a little bit on that in this talk. Here is what we will do together. So if you notice the image of the helicopter in the opening slide, this is a very big picture aerial view. So we're not going to do a deep dive. Instead, I want you to get a sense of what the terrain is, right? What are some of the options, what's happening where, with the idea that you might then decide where you want to dig in, which makes sense for your context and your work. To then ground that and support you in making some of those choices or thinking through some of the choices, the middle of the talk is going to move through an evaluation planning tool. It's quite simple. It's a table, and there's two versions, one that allows you to take notes alongside when you're listening into the talk, and another that gives you options, some of the main methods and some of the resources for those methods, as well as choices about those methods. So I know Shreya, I think, dropped the link in the chat. I did as well. If you want to open those handouts alongside the chat, you're welcome to do that. If you revisit the talk later, you're also welcome to use that then. And then we'll close out to think a little bit about, so what next? And that'll be a chance for you to ask some more questions and also make connections in terms of what area you might want to dig into to apply in your context. I should say too that, let's see, I started sort of studying system science and complexity sciences in around 2011, 2012. That's when I started my PhD studies in evaluation. And it was an area that was pretty new to the evaluation field. So I was on the margins in terms of my interests and did a lot of side study of systems and complexity. And then much of my research agenda is around bringing the two together, bringing systems and evaluation and weaving them into one change process. So the terrain. To get going, this cartoon by Chris Lacey, who's a cartoonist in the evaluation space, does anyone else feel like we could do better? I mean, this is really why we're here in terms of early childhood development. Each of you has ideas about how you could do better in relation to serving children, families, in your contexts. And then evaluators often ask this question as well, like, is what we're doing making a difference? Is it making enough of a difference? How can we sustain that difference? And we're going to talk about this question about doing better at another level, which is how we evaluate that ability to make a difference in terms of the issues that we care about. So there's a sort of second look over the way that we evaluate that's going to be threaded throughout this talk to say, not only can we do better in the change work that we're after, but can we do better in how we conceptualize and evaluate that work as well. Those of you in the evaluation space or in the applied research or intervention implementation research space, this is sort of the conventional way of thinking about evaluation in relation to change. In the top of the image, you start with a clearly defined social problem or need. Like, what is that gap? What is that disparity? What is the need? Designing an intervention and thinking really clearly about how the activities are going to come together to address that need or problem. And then at some point evaluating it, evaluating how the intervention is working and whether it's working in terms of its outcomes and impacts. So this has been a long-standing default model in the social and applied sciences in terms of how we understand what it means to make things better. The other thing you see about the arrows is that evaluation can actually inform how we understand the problem and need as well as the intervention. And typically the evaluation is conducted by this external expert, which you see in this icon. And the ultimate goal of evaluation is to say, what's the value of the intervention? What's the quality of the intervention? Which often gets interpreted as, is it working? This default mindset in terms of evaluation is something that we're going to challenge with systems and complexity informed evaluation. So if we sort of tease it apart and think through some of the other assumptions, this is a generalization, so these may or may not align with your work. There are a lot of different ways of doing evaluation, and so some deviate more and some are closely aligned to this. This is generally sort of the set of ways of working that is associated with the evidence-based policy and practice movement as well. So why do we evaluate? Because we want to know if interventions work, and we want to know specifically if they address the underlying problem or need that they were designed to address. This supports a kind of incremental social change, addressing one problem at a time. Who is involved in evaluation? Funders as commissioners and clients. Evaluators, as I mentioned, or researchers come in as the expert, primarily retained in social science methodologies. And then we work with a lot of different groups, but primarily as sources of data, right? And people who will use and make decisions based on that data. What do we focus on? We focus on the intervention, right? We zoom right in and say, what is it that you're doing? What are the sets of activities and how do those connect to the outcomes you care about, which are often predetermined? So then how do we do the evaluation? Again, remember, this is sort of the default that we're going to be challenging. How do we do evaluation? Primarily based on evidence, right? We want to know about the data. We want to know about the evidence and whether or not it supports questions of the intervention working and how it works. We understand change primarily linearly, and sort of going off of that model from a process of identifying and assessing the need to designing and then implementing the intervention, then studying the outcomes and impacts. And then the idea for so what is that as we build evidence for each individual intervention, over time, we can address the larger issue because the interventions hypothetically should work together in some way. So let's talk through who's challenging this model and then what this alternative systems and complexity informed evaluation can bring.
Emily, can I just interrupt you 1 minute?
Yeah, and I just saw your note, Shekufe.
Okay, thank you.
And I do see your chat. Perfect. Thank you. This is okay. So this model is getting challenged by many different spaces, and we're here as one space, right, to inquire into how it's being challenged. So in the philanthropic sector, in the private foundation world and community foundation world in the US, there's a big critique of evaluation and the way that we do it in terms of equity, primarily in terms of racial equity, asking questions about why and how evaluation can better advance equity as its central mission and its central purpose. Another place where there's a critique of that conventional model has to do with systems change itself. So in the US, you see there's two government examples, one from the Institute of Education Sciences, one from the National Science Foundation. And these are federal government agencies in the US that have said, we have been investing to address issues in STEM, in sciences, technology, engineering, mathematics, as well as education for some time at the individual policy and program level. But now we want to know if our investments are having system change and how can we better give grants federally to actually support system change. The private investing space is asking quite similar questions. So the world of impact investing and social investing, there are different companies globally that are saying we want to have more impact on the climate crisis, on social inequality, and we want to know how to be strategic about financing investments that activate system change and system transformation. So again, the point of this slide is to say that there are calls for us to rethink the way we evaluate that are getting sounded across different sectors. Community advocates. So this is one example, a guide about why am I always being researched. This has to do with who and which communities are identified as quote unquote at risk or in need, and the extent to which they're excluded from the research and evaluation process, as well as the understanding of what needs to be happening and what the change process should look like. So the advocacy corners are also extending calls to action. And then most of you, I think, are calling in internationally in the international development space, in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals and also the United Nations Development Program. There are some big global efforts to say, how do we actually set goals and strategy to advance system change work? And the green box in the bottom right, the portfolio approach, is from the United Nations Development Program. They're looking at expanding beyond individual projects to think about a portfolio approach, which the portfolio then is designed to assess system change or to support and then assess system change. So this conventional model that says evaluators come in as these experts that are largely outside of the intervention, they use their social science methodologies to answer questions about whether the intervention works to address an individual problem, contributing to this broader evidence-based policy and practice. That sort of logic is what's getting challenged across all of these different sectors. And then the alternative, one of the major alternatives getting identified is how to take a systems and complexity orientation to change, which includes how we understand the issues, the change process, and how we evaluate. So I will walk through this one a bit more slowly than the conventional because my expectation was the conventional is somewhat familiar to you. This is one way of saying what is systemic evaluation in one slide, right? What is the alternative? There are different versions of this alternative, and I will show you some of those. But in general, why are we evaluating gets shifted from assessing an individual intervention to actually saying, how do we redirect the existing interventions and designing new ones to influence change in large-scale systems, and also shift the underlying conditions that give rise to the issues that we're seeing as symptoms. So the evaluation function becomes so much more than looking at an individual intervention and seeing whether it works. It's really about saying, how do we design better? How do we redirect better from this systems orientation? Who is involved in the process is no longer sort of primarily the relationship between the funder, commissioner, the evaluator, and then those participating. Instead, it's thinking about who are all the groups involved in and affected by the system or the situation which we want to enact change in. So those are a lot of different actor groups, and they all have important perspectives to bring into the process. We will talk about some ways to do that. Evaluators, whether you work at a university, a large firm, an NGO, or wherever else sort of you're stationed in terms of your workplace, you've shifted into this collaborative role and this facilitative role. There are limits to your expertise, even no matter how sort of savvy and sophisticated you are in terms of certain methodologies, because the evaluation is partial in itself. And we need that sort of collaboration to come together to co-design both the intervention and the evaluation. I love some of the comments in the chat, and I love seeing the continuous introduction. So yes, if you're just joining in, please continue to introduce yourself, tell us where you're from, and welcome. So in this what row, what do we focus on then? This is also a big question. If evaluators are not just looking at the intervention that somebody already has, but we're trying to redirect it and think about how it can activate greater change in the wider context, it means that we're not thinking about one intervention, even if that's our task at the beginning. In terms of both design and evaluation, it's much more about multi-solving, thinking about the right portfolio or package of interventions to address multiple leverage points and the underlying root causes. And this could be at different scales and to different degrees of depth. So we'll look at what some of that means in terms of the change process, but the idea here is not to sort of narrowly bound the problem and isolate a couple of goals that are measurable. It's more to think about how different kinds of interventions work together, whether or not they support change in the same direction, and that sort of multi-solving approach. How are we going to do that? The primary ways to do that are to draw on systems and complexity approaches, and that's really the heart and most of what we'll walk through in this presentation. And the other piece that I already hinted at is that we have to embed evaluation. So when I talk about the kind of evaluation questions we can ask, they're not just going to be about outcomes and impact, because evaluators should really be at the table from the beginning, or applied researchers, again, depending on how your role is designated. We should be in partnership with the different actor groups from the beginning, ideally to understand what's happening, co-design that change process, and embed ways to evaluate along the way. So now this is not necessarily in opposition to the evidence-based policy and practice movement. That is still important, especially as we build evidence and aggregate and analyze across different types of intervention studies and different types of evaluations. That's important. But oftentimes the purposes and the so what of systemic evaluation is framed in terms of not just about building evidence and knowledge building, but it's a form of mutual accountability, a form of learning for those different groups involved and affected. How do they learn about the system, what the changes are that need to happen, and then continuously adapt? And we'll talk about each of those purposes more as well. And then ultimately disseminate, yes, within the early childhood development field in this case, but there's a growing literature that's interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary within the systems space and the systems change space additionally. So there's a lot to learn about how we do this work. And so this is my little plug that if you are engaged in this work, there's a lot of different types of people that'll care about what you're learning, what you're encountering, and those types of things. Okay, so systemic evaluation is an alternative to the conventional evaluation. There have been a lot of calls getting us toward it, pointing us toward it. This is going to shift not into like why it matters. The first talk by Michael and Charmaine Patton addressed some of that. I'm going to be shifting into how, what can we draw on, and what is our thinking process for bringing those things together. So as I said, in terms of the how, and why you're here, right, is that there are these systems and complexity approaches. This is what's exciting. We don't have to reinvent everything. The systems and complexity science fields have been around a long time, since, let's say, the 1950s. Some would say earlier, and they originated from the intersection of different disciplines. And that was mentioned in the early talk as well. So there are these existing approaches we can draw on. These are the systems and complexity fields. I know they're small because we're not going to get into the distinctions within them now, but the top map is a map of the systems fields. The bottom map is a map of the complexity sciences. And they developed in different ways over historical time periods. So there are contributions of different individual scholars, there's contributions of different disciplines, and then there are different theories and methodologies that get developed through those. So it's like a hub of knowledge that we can tap into. So that's one thing. When we say systems and complexity approaches, sometimes people just mean the fields themselves. What are the approaches originating in those fields? Another way of talking about the systems and complexity approaches is to say the actual methods and methodologies. So these are two books, and we're going to look at some methods in more detail in a little bit: Systems, Concepts, and Action, and then Systems Mapping. So each of these covers a range of methods, and there are many others that organize and cover different systems methods. Each methodology is a whole methodology designed to answer specific types of questions or facilitate types of processes. And these are both very practical books. So if you are excited about a particular method or want to see what options there are, they're really good resources. And then lastly, some people talk about a systems and complexity approach as the core concepts. There are a lot of new concepts that can feel like jargon, especially at the beginning. But there are three that are known as like sort of anchor concepts in the system space. And there are different ones in the complexity space that I know future talks in this series will get to as well. But sort of the core anchor topic, the concepts that were also covered in the first session, are around interrelationships. Like, how do you see the way things are interconnected? How do relationships generate change, generate higher level outcomes? Questions like that. On the right there, perspectives. What are the different vantage points and viewpoints that people bring, the different values and interests they bring? So just the combination of this sort of interconnections and perspectives is complexity, right? Like, that is one way of understanding complexity, is that it is about those interactions and the perspectives, because we're social beings, that we bring to those interactions. That itself generates a lot of complexity. And then boundaries and boundary setting is that we know we can't look at everything through all perspectives. We can't look at all the interrelationships. So how do we set boundaries? So what I want you to take away from this slide is that, like, I'm going to be doing each of these in the rest of the talk. We're going to be drawing on the systems and complexity fields, looking at specific methods, and those methods are going to foreground different concepts that are going to help us understand and facilitate the work that we want to be doing. Yes, and the presentation is available. I don't know if Shreya can drop the link once more. The presentation will be available, and so will the handouts, which we'll get to in the middle part of this. So a couple more slides, and then we're going to pause and dialogue with Aisha a little bit to get some initial reactions and ideas about how this connects to early childhood development, and then I'll switch into the evaluation planning part. So let me just give you a minute to look at this image, this doodle. Thanks, Shreya. So what this is showing, there's a person on the top, there's another person on the bottom. The person on the top has like almost like a little hammer. They have a cloud that's representing their thought, saying, I see systems I can engineer. And then they've got this image of what they see happening around them. And there's all these little blobs, each one representing a system. And on the right, it says, the world is systemic. So this first sort of way of thinking, sometimes it's called hard systems, or the system sciences, that really emphasizes the sciences part of it. It's this idea that systems sort of exist out there in the world, and we're trying to change them. We're trying to change them through design and engineering, but they themselves exist. So there's an emphasis on systems as real world entities. You talk about systems all the time, right, in our everyday life. So they are real. It's not that they're not real. But this other way of thinking that I'll talk about acknowledges that each of us actually would bound a system differently. So the process of deciding what is a system and what is outside of that system is a human social learning process. So different methodologies make different assumptions about this, which I'll identify as well. I just want you to be aware of that these are two ways of thinking about systems thinking and what it means to do system change work that are not necessarily at odds, but sometimes we make different assumptions on one side or the other. So the bottom one is a person saying, I see complexity and confusion. They see all those interactions that I mentioned, all the different perspectives. And then they say, but I can explore it as a learning system, this known as soft systems. The point of this lower one is just to acknowledge that the world is interdependent in its natural state. It is in flux, it is changing. No matter who we are, we're always limited by the view that we bring, and the position that we're in. And so the process of understanding what is the system and how do we design, change around the system, whether the system is the intervention or set of interventions or the evaluation, requires us to sort of come together and develop a process. So this way of saying it is that systems are constructs to learn about the world. And sometimes there's like a real tension between this. Do you mean a real world thing or do you mean a construct? I want you to be sort of aware of this, but at the same time, I will use them as interchangeably. So oftentimes when we work with different stakeholder groups, we start out talking about a real system, like, oh, the healthcare system, the education system, or the child support services system. And then when we get into the change process and the evaluation process, that's when we have to say, how are we constructing what we mean by a system? Okay, so two ways of thinking about systems. Now, one more layer, systems change. I had the image of the systems fields, the different methods, the concepts, talked about one debate within the field in terms of systems as real world and also as constructs. A lot of the work on system change is coming out of practice. It's not coming out of the system sciences as much as was acknowledged in the first talk. Like the assumption in the system sciences is that systems are always changing. Change doesn't necessarily mean improvement or better. Whereas when we see words like systems change and systems innovation, oftentimes there's a normative piece. People are saying, how do we make systems work better, more equitably, more sustainably, or whatever that better means. So we also need a definition of systems change. This is a somewhat simple one. So changes to the system structure and the conditions that give rise to the social problems, needs, and disparities. This is often what we mean by systems change, like the way that the set of things are happening that affect the problems that we care about need to shift so that those outcomes, those disparities, or whatever it else is, gets resolved in a really deep way so that we don't then in some time see that issue again. If we were going to try to picture this, I'm going to walk us through this picture as well, because then we'll come back to it. So in this sort of simplistic diagram of a system, you see there's the environment on the outside, there's a line, that's the boundary between the environment and the system. What's inside the line is the system. You'll see a bunch of purple dots, which are the relationships. Whatever those factors are, they could be people, they could be causal factors, they could be agencies, right? Those elements could be different, but they're in relationship to each other such that those interactions produce some kind of output on the right side. Now, I overlaid a couple of yellow boxes inside of that because I wanted to depict the idea that systems change is actually about deploying interventions inside systems and thinking about how those interventions affect the overall system and also what the relationship between those interventions are. So the yellow boxes are meant to simplify or symbolize interventions, and the purple factors are some of those things inside the system that affect the intervention. We could also get much more detail, right, and draw out some of those environmental factors. So the idea of system change is how do we change the way the system is functioning? There are a couple examples, and when we get into the actual process, we'll see some more as well. So, and this was mentioned in the first talk as well, these could be at different scales or at different levels. So we could think about an individual child as a system in terms of their biology and neurology, their psychology, as well as those social and interpersonal and environmental factors that all shape their development. So that boundary of what's a system could be at an individual child level. It could be about parenting, which I know Aisha is going to talk us through a little bit as well. So we could think about parenting itself within a household or within a community as a system. We could identify some of those purple dots as the economic, education, cultural, health, and other types of factors that affect parenting. And then in that example, parenting and the quality of parenting is like the output or the type of thing we're looking at that emerges from those interactions of the system. And then we could also think about it as sort of this conventional system level that we often use in society, like child welfare as a system, which really we mean the institution or the set of institutional arrangements. So the policies and services that interact to intentionally or to try to provide safety and care to children. So when we talk about system change, it's not necessarily large scale. It can be at any level, but it's a way of thinking about and understanding the system first and foremost, and then thinking about where and how we would intervene and what does that mean in terms of our ability to affect change in a sustained way. Then there's a question of how do we evaluate all of this? And I'm just going to point to the tons of work that's happening. And then in the middle part of the talk, we will simplify that work into just a couple of things, a couple of main questions to consider. But when we talk about, if I were to go back one, like when we were talking about evaluating systems change or evaluating a program or intervention as a system, one option that you would have is to follow an existing evaluation approach. There are different evaluation models and approaches that have a systems and complexity orientation built in. And so those present good guidebooks and good models if one was aligned and you wanted to apply it. As I mentioned, there's also a lot of system change guidance emerging. And within the overall system change process, there is a section on learning and adapting, which has some aspects of systems measurement, monitoring, and learning in it. So some of the system change guidance can also be a good resource. Again, I'm not going to choose either of these because we're going to do a sort of simplified way in this talk. But you could follow an evaluation approach, you could follow system change guidance. As I mentioned, there are also methodologies, so you could learn about a method. We will talk about some of those, and then you could think about how to apply that one or multiple methods together in your evaluation. And as I mentioned, there are concepts or principles. So Michael Patton identified and Sharmeen, they went through some of the principles for systems thinking and evaluation on the right. You could use those principles, and there's a book here, Systemic Evaluation Design, that uses those as well. So in terms of like the terrain on what systems mean, what system change means, and then how do we evaluate interventions from that orientation, these are sort of big buckets of what options you have. And from my perspective, this can be very overwhelming because there's tons of options. And as I mentioned, the systems and complexity fields themselves are quite huge and vast with a lot of choices. So what we will do in a little bit is try to simplify those choices and give you an evaluation planning process. So if you're in the middle of a research project on an intervention, or you work on the intervention side and you want to think about, oh, how do we design differently or how do we evaluate differently? The middle part of this talk, we're going to walk through some of those things to sort of anchor it around some of the options that you have. But these are also really good resources that have been developed and that are out there. So I want to stop now and engage Aisha to get some reaction, some discussion in terms of her context, her work. And then, as I said, I'll take us into that evaluation planning part.
Thanks so much, Emily. And this is a really helpful way for us all to reflect. So I want to maybe just give a little bit of context about my work, and then really explore how some of what you're discussing and introducing to us can really be applied to help us make that shift from the traditional way we've been working in the child development field, to really taking into account more complexity-informed evaluation. So I work in the field of parenting, and over the last 20 years, there's been a kind of robust body of evidence that's to say, we know generally that if we implement a parenting program, in different communities around the world, if it's done with sufficient quality, it will make some difference for young children. It will make some difference for their parents. But we also know that that impact is going to vary, right? So all around the world, we see different levels of impact based on where children live, their family circumstances, the systems that operate around the families, the formal sector systems like health or education or social protection. And so, for example, in work that I've done in Pakistan, we can provide a weekly home visit to mothers, and we can provide guidance on how to provide nurturing care for their young children, how to engage responsively, how to promote early play and learning. But we know that the mother's capacity to follow all of that advice is going to be based on what resources does she have? Does she have enough food coming into the house? Does she have enough autonomy to seek support for things that might be inhibiting those practices, like depression that she might be experiencing? Does she have the capacity that if we make a referral for her child, that she can navigate from that referral to find the right support that she might need, for example, to for healthcare for her child or for a development review with her child in the health sector? And so all these things start to influence the kinds of impact we can make. So if we're going to shift from doing a traditional evaluation that says, okay, we've implemented this parenting program, here's an impact. We've even engaged the community, right? We've asked them what they thought of the intervention, what were their barriers, what were the enablers, and we've reported it. But then we stop there. How do we start to shift and take in all of that complexity? And how do we do it in a way that's realistic without going back to this term that you used, without being overwhelmed? Because it seems a big task to take on, and I worry about how much we can really change in any one time point that we're working.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really great set of connections. And I'm also looking at some of the questions in the chat, and I think you have some of these similar questions about, like, what does it mean for evaluators to step into the space? Are they really ready? What can they do that's realistic? What kind of budget can support that kind of work? Are we prepared to do that as researchers and evaluators? Do we have that kind of training? So Aisha, I think if it's all right with you, I'll go into the evaluation planning process, which is really a change in evaluation planning process. And I think that will answer some of those questions about how to prioritize and what to prioritize, depending on who you are, where in the context you are. The other thing I'll say is, like, your set of remarks is totally in line with some of the critiques that are out there, right? People are saying we've done interventions in this space. We do have a good deal of evidence in this area or that area, but we're getting limited in terms of the types of impacts we can have over time, given the amount of resources, but also the amount of coordination we would need to sustain that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the evaluation planning tool and process. And in it, I will say, I also want to acknowledge one of these comments, I think it was by Dennis, that yes, most evaluators are not ready to do this work. But part of sort of the argument of this talk is that we are evaluators and applied researchers are often reinforcing a way of going about change that is very micro focused on individual problems, individual interventions, and we've gotten good at ignoring those interdependencies. And so acknowledging them within the change and design process is a call to action, but it's also a way of actually engaging with the depth and breadth of systems methods. Most of the systems methods are designed to move us through that kind of change process. They're not evaluation methods, they're systems methods. If we bring them to evaluation, we're better equipped to do some of that work. And so there's a lot of implications then for our training as well. But okay, so what could this process look like? So if you are someone who wants to apply as we go, I would encourage you to download the handouts or open up the handouts as Google Docs. I will drop that link once more in the chat right now. You can find them on the left side of that web page in terms of resources to learn more. This is a simple process we'll move through. How do you clarify the purpose? Like why, in what is the evaluation supposed to accomplish? What are the types of questions the evaluation can focus on? And what are the methods? What are some of the method choices, since that was one of the big goals of this overall masterclass? And then this is a table. So as I mentioned at the beginning, there's a blank version that you can actually take notes to start, like, oh, I like this, or this is what we already do, or hey, this is something I want to learn more about. And then there's a version that's all filled out, not for a real case, but it's filled out with some of the choices you have. So I did a big sweep of what I know and what I know from the fields, from different projects, to try to fold in a lot of the great resources that are existing so that you can tap into some of those in terms of after the session, you're learning more. So what are the purposes? It's not about evidence building alone, and I'm going to put that to the side because we do know about that in terms of the broader landscape. That's one form of learning. And it's also not about accountability to funders or to the government or whomever that external agency is alone. So I'm going to talk about three main purposes: accountability, learning, and adaptation. And these are purposes for the design of the evaluation or the function of the evaluation, whether that's done by an evaluation team or a co-design team of people engaged in the intervention and the evaluation team. So first, I'm going to talk about what are each of these purposes, what are some of the meanings that are coming out of the system science and system change space to see what might resonate and align with your context. Then I'm going to move into 5 types of questions and then talk about some of the methods for each of those types of questions. So what does accountability mean? There's some push against accountability in the system space and the systems change work, especially because accountability gets very narrowly framed as accountability to the funders, those with power, those with money, those with the highest level of influence, yet not necessarily those directly involved and affected, right? And so this is one form of external accountability. It could also be to policymakers or even the wider public. But the idea is that we're leading with accountability external to what it is that we're doing, the local community, the local context, the local set of circumstances. And that is sort of an external accountability. It's not that it doesn't matter, it does matter, but we don't want to narrow the evaluation to be only serving those audiences. As I said, in the system space, it's about who's involved and affected, all those differing groups. Since this is a change process and an evaluation within the change process designed to support them in the change efforts, how do we actually be accountable to them and those groups, however they get defined? There's also an opportunity to center equity and really a requirement to center equity, to think about who and which groups are most marginalized, most vulnerable in the context. Maybe those should be prioritized. Oftentimes they should be. So those should be the ones driving who the evaluation process is accountable to and for. And then there's also these ideas of future generations and the broader environment or ecological system, which came up in the first talk as well. So sometimes we can think about accountability in terms of history and present, and we forget about the fact that a lot of times we're doing this work to benefit future generations. And so what does it look like to design an evaluation process that's accountable to non-human, right, actors as well as future generations? So these are just choices in terms of types of external accountability that you could design around. There's also in system change space a lot of emphasis on these sorts of internal accountability. And what I want to point out here is it's not an internal accountability. If you're in the implementation science space, sometimes we think about like implementation fidelity or adherence to the design of the intervention, which might be one of the questions, might be one of the focuses. But this type of internal accountability is actually about why you're doing the work you're doing. What is your vision? So Aisha, in our earlier conversation before this masterclass, she had shared sort of her vision for parents and for parents in different communities, particularly in Pakistan, having the resources, the supports, the knowledge that they need to support child development, right? A very necessary and beautiful vision. So how do you design evaluation to support accountability of that vision? Is that vision happening? How can we better actualize and support that vision, right? As an example. It could be accountability to principles, like ways of working together. It could be accountability to sort of an envisioned desired system or an imagined future. And we're going to talk a little bit about the futures methods as well in this talk, but it could be this idea of what's possible. So sometimes we get so stuck in what's not working and all the factors that are impeding and contributing to disparities in terms of outcomes that we're not in the space of what's possible. You can also try to be accountable to what's possible. So accountability in our planning process is one type of purpose, and there's a distinction between internal and external, and these are some of those. I'm trying to sort of broaden your perspective on who evaluation and evaluative processes should serve and what, and that then can guide the rest of the evaluation if you get clear about which ones you're privileging. So next, talking about learning. I'm not sure if this is familiar or not to you. There are different ways of modeling single versus double versus triple loop learning. And this blue part in the top right is often where we are. Michael Patton talked about the project mindset, focusing on individual interventions, which are those actions. We could think about the actions in the left side of the blue box as the intervention. That's what we do. And the results on the right side is the outcomes or impacts we care about. So oftentimes we sort of zoom right in and we're like, is what we're doing having the results that we want? And then evaluation steps in that sort of feedback loop, as I showed in the conventional slide as well, to one, evidence the results and attribute the claims about results to the intervention. So this is all really bounded, known as single loop learning. It doesn't ask deeper questions underlying the work. Let's see. So single loop learning is really about, are we doing things right? It means you're happy with your goals, you're happy with your intervention design, and you want to know, and you're happy with the implementation, and you want to know if the results are happening for the most part. And then maybe how can we improve upon the existing model? So double loop learning sort of zooms out and asks, are we doing the right things? This means that the way that the problem got framed and the intervention design got laid out, or the way that the implementation is happening, all those things might need to be re-examined and changed in a deeper way to better have the kind of change that you want to see. So it's asking the question, are we doing the right thing? Should we change what we're doing? All the way to the point of, should we change our goals, right? Should we change our vision? And sometimes that is necessary, especially when different groups have been excluded from setting those goals and those visions, and also as the circumstances change. And then the last type of triple loop learning, which really gets into the transformational space, which was in the first class as well, asks what makes this the right thing to do. There are so many people from around the world on this call. You know much better than I in terms of the ways in which cultural worldviews, whether that's from the US, whether that's from the West more broadly, whether that's from the global North, right? Ideas about what the needs are, the so-called needs are, what the interventions should be, often get exported from one place to another, right? Or from one worldview to another. And so the local community doesn't think that's the right thing to do. There are actually perceptions and ways of framing what's happening that are behind our change efforts that sometimes need to get interrogated themselves, especially from a cross-cultural and a decolonial orientation. So triple loop learning is really asking if this is even the right thing to be doing. And that's sort of the deepest type of transformative learning. Great. I see an example from Ian. Do we need to change the paradigm? Yes, the underlying sort of paradigm that's driving the work. So we talked about accountability. We talked about learning now, single, double, triple loop learning. If you're following along with your handout, right, you could be starring or taking notes on the kinds of things that you would want to prioritize in an evaluation planning process. That's sort of the practical application of what I'm moving through. So then lastly, adaptation. There's a lot of talk in the systems and complexity space of adapting, but adapting for what? Adapting toward what? Is all adaptation good? How is evaluation supporting adaptation, right? Those are giant questions. And so I'm just going to make 3 distinctions between types of adaptation and what that might mean for the kind of evaluation. So like one adaptation or ways of making change is to improve. And this I'm framing more in terms of the single loop learning, but it's about getting better with the current goals and processes. Improvement, right? We often want improvement, but sometimes improvement, as I said, doesn't question the underlying goals and processes, let alone what's behind those. But it is about increases. It is about better. It is about, continuing on a path, but to increasing extent, right? So it might be that you already see some improvement and you want to increase it, right? Or you already see some positive difference and you want to increase it, or you want to assess whether it's increasing. Innovation, which somebody asked in a question about developmental evaluation versus what I'm talking about. Developmental evaluation fits within this broad umbrella of systems and complexity informed evaluation. Developmental evaluation is meant to support innovation. So innovation is about new goals, new processes, new possibilities. It's not about taking an intervention model and making it better or replicating it in a new scale or in a new context. Innovation is about developing a new type of change process altogether, sometimes in relation to new goals. Could be social, could be technological. And then the last one is adaptation itself, which I would distinguish from improvement and innovation. Adaptation in the system space is about like what's inside the system boundary, what's in the environment outside of the system boundary. How do you adapt what's happening inside to those internal changes, and how do you also adapt and respond to the external changes? So adaptation is slightly different than improvement and innovation, because you often need a lot of information about context to support adaptation. And we're going to talk about this in terms of the future as well. You can't just sort of look at what's happening now or what happened over the last 5 years. You have to actually look into the future to anticipate types of external changes that might affect to then support adaptation. Great, seeing some great conversation as well in the chat. So to take a minute or so to pause before I transition to some of the questions, to like put this into practice, whether you're in a team organization on your own, if you were going to try to apply this, the idea is to like take the context, right, that you're working in, and then identify, are one of these primary purposes driving the work, right? Or should they be driving the work? Accountability, learning, adaptation. Maybe there are other purposes on your radar that have to get privileged. I will say too that this itself is a pretty important decision. And I think Bob Williams talks in the next masterclass about boundary critique and critical systems. Setting purposes is, consequential. And it is a boundary setting exercise, but we start there with evaluation planning. So accountability, learning, adaptation. And then are there any arrows you would put, right, in terms of places you'd want to learn more or discuss with others? Okay, I'm going to move in our interest of time to the questions, but that in a process, as I said, that should get us going. Like you're beginning by saying, why are we doing this? Why really are we doing this evaluation? And to what end and to whose end? Next, the way I've organized the middle part is all about the types of questions you could ask and then how those questions relate to the method choices that you have. I'm going to talk about 5 types, which in my current book project with Pablo, like we're developing these out. There are different ways of organizing methods and how they align with evaluation questions. I put some of those in the resources. I'm going to move through questions that bring the change process and the evaluation process together. So some of them lean heavier on the design and the understanding the problem. Some of them lean heavier on the evaluation side. But the reason why I've laid it out this way is because we can maximize then the types of methods we can draw on from the systems and complexity fields. So this is a simple image to indicate how I've organized this. And I will say it's sort of from bottom to top. So if we want to know the value of something in relation to system change, or are we having the change that we want at a systems level, I would argue that we can't start there. We have to have this preceding work done or know about the work, because a systemic orientation should really begin at the very beginning, which has to do with understanding what's happening in the situation or the system and systems. And that understanding has to be explored systemically before you go into designing a change process. That would be the next one. Then asking questions about outcomes and impacts and looking at outcomes and impacts of the change process. Then factoring in future scenarios and how that might affect everything below. And then ultimately we can get to this sort of primary heart of evaluation questions. What's the value of our work? What's the significance of the work? So my intention now is to move from bottom to top here, tell you a little bit about each one, show you a simple example at a high level, which you can then hyperlink and look at more, and give you a sense of, like I said, the methods choices for each of these. So I think in the layout is I'll go through two, the complex situation and change process, and then invite Aisha again to make any comments or connections. So exploring the situation or system, this is what most systems approaches are about, which is why it's hard to use them as evaluators in evaluation if we're not there at the table at the beginning. So this is really the question of what's going on. There's a distinction between situation or system. I personally use the phrase situation in my work, as I said, because people understand what the system is differently. So I like to start with what's the situation that you think is problematic, or what are the circumstances you think need to be changed? Like what's wrong, what's right? Where do we need to have change and why? So it's this loosely bounded real world set of circumstances. And primary, I mean, one of the questions, there's many we could ask, but like one of the questions I ask is like, how do different people experience the situation and perceive what needs to change? And I'll talk about a method to support that. So it's very exploratory. It can be done at different points, even if there's an existing intervention, but you want to know the broader context in which the intervention is situated in terms of what warrants change. The second one is about a system itself. Maybe you are already interested in a system or set of systems. Sometimes people have, phrases like, oh, this system is broken, or this disparity is because of this system. And so right away, the question is, how do people understand that system? What are the interdependent set of entities or elements that function together as a whole? How are they distinguished from their environment? So a question you could ask is like, what are the relationships, dynamics, or conditions that need to change regarding that system? I make this distinction. Yes. Oh, I love that, Silva, and I'm glad I saw that comment right away. Silva's pointing out this appreciative inquiry. Yes. So sometimes actually myself, I can fall into that trap of thinking sort of from a deficit orientation of, oh, what's problematic, what's wrong, what warrant change. But both these ideas of situation and system can very much be approached from an asset-based and appreciative lens as well, right? Like what's going right, what's a strength, what can we build on here? And the methods that I'll talk about actually foreground that just as well. And some of the language choices you make in framing their use can make a big difference for what you get as well. So some of the method options I mentioned already, there's a lot on systems mapping. Those themselves can either be about like, what are the actors? How do they relate to each other? Actually, I have a couple examples here, but so these are good resources to click on. There's a book on system diagrams. There's an open access course from the Open University and several other books. They give you a menu of options. Some of them are very accessible. I'll show you one you can learn, I promise, in like 5 minutes or less and use. And then they build out in terms of their sophistication, both in terms of the mathematics and in terms of the technical aspect. Yes, and there's a session on causal loop diagramming this image right now tomorrow. So if you know a lot of the factors that are interacting, and you want to do a kind of analysis of how those relationships function causally, and what are the feedback loops that are generating certain patterns, like causal loop diagrams is for you. So that's one option. You might know about social network analysis already. Social network analysis can look at communication patterns, information flows, other things between nodes or agents, like in a broader network. Rich picture is the one I'll talk about because it's highly accessible and also very versatile. Excuse me, but these are just a couple. So the idea here is that there are systems methods for exploring situations, exploring systems, and these can be done just by your team, but often they're done in a participatory manner. So there's really good guidance on how do you facilitate workshops that engage different groups in doing these as well. The quick example I'll show is called Rich Pictures. I use these a lot, like I've used them for 5, 6 more than that years now. In my context, I use these with STEM faculty. I think this would be a great one. I'm seeing Patricia's comment with like parents, kids. So this is a simple one that you can have kids, like young children, engage in as well. Literacy level, right? Language level, that doesn't matter because this is all about drawing without words. So it's one reason why I like it is that it's quite accessible. It comes from soft systems methodology. So I use this with STEM faculty who want to make change at their institutions, their higher education institutions, like in their engineering department or in their entire university, in terms of improving science education. And this is an image of one. There are many images online. This is a very simple one. But the idea is that you ask somebody, what's happening in the situation that needs to change? That's it. What's happening in the situation that needs to change? You can refine that prompt, you can, tweak that prompt, but it should be very open in terms of what do you understand that's going on here? And you can even say, what are some assets or strengths we want to build on? What are some areas that we need to fix, address, etc.? Or what is happening in the circumstance that's generating this disparity, right? If you start with a disparity frame. And so what people draw is extremely illogical in the sense that most people get uncomfortable. They haven't actually not used words, especially if they're adults, especially if they're highly educated or more educated, right? They're used to using their analytical brain. And this is much more of a free form, unstructured, show us what's on paper. It's a beautiful method because you actually get a lot of different types of things. You get interpretations about power and resources. You get differing perspectives. You get big conflicts that are deep that nobody likes to talk about, that usually don't get surfaced, etc. So I won't be able to say in too much detail, but in terms of this specific image, you see sort of a government agency in the top right doling out money. And then there's a university campus, which is like the main part of the picture. In the bottom left, there's sort of the sciences, like where the knowledge comes from. And so the funder and the sciences are sort of external bodies, right? And what's really happening on campus is this main situation that's being depicted. And then they've got ideas in here about departments and who has resources, who has knowledge, who's impacting the students to differing degrees. And so there's a lot of layered meaning, and there's different processes where you can just ask people, like in the photo here, we just ask people after they draw. It usually takes between 20 minutes to a whole hour, depending on if you're drawing individually or in teams. So tell us what's happening. And then after they tell us what's happening, you can do different types of interpretation within or across groups to sort of identify what might need to change or what contextual factors are affecting implementation, etc. There's a lot of different ways that you can adapt this. Yes, you can do it both ways. You can have one picture per person. You can have one picture as a group. The original method is usually about a group co-drawing. And so the drawing process itself is a way of people negotiating across their different perspectives. People are talking, going back and forth as they're drawing. An advantage of that is that you end up with a picture that sort of everybody's perspective gets folded into, but then that can be a disadvantage. Sometimes you want to separate groups like based on their role, different parts of the community or different professional roles, etc. Sometimes you want to segment groups, have them do separate pictures. And sometimes you want individuals to do their own picture and then share it and then try to look for patterns. So there are a lot of different ways to do this. Yes, and okay, I'm going to move on for our time, but yes, it can, yeah, I'm going to just move on for time for now. I saw a couple other comments in there. So that was just one method. Let me go back a little bit so I keep where we are. But there are all these methods, and some of them are much more robust and systematic. You have to bring data to each point. You actually can model mathematically what's happening behind the scenes in terms of causality. So it really depends on how much and to what extent you're trying to understand the nature of the situation or system. But there's a lot to pick from for that first one. For our sort of talk in the broader frame, that doesn't tell us what to do. It doesn't tell us how to design a change process. It helps us understand what's going on from multiple perspectives, considering all the factors, but what does it mean to influence change? So this is sort of the next set of questions you can ask, and whether you want to jump right in here is an open question as well. So the next one is about a change process, and this is the theory of change space. This came up in the first talk as well. Yes, in evaluation, we might know about logic models, and theory of change is more sophisticated logic models that get at underlying change processes, causal mechanisms, and processes. There's a whole bunch of things to adapt that to be more systemic and be more complexity informed. We don't necessarily throw out the model building process. And I know there's a talk by Johnny Morell in the future with complex adaptive systems being brought together with model building. So it's still about a model building. And as we build this model, then we're asking questions like, what are the potential leverage points to influence change? So if you have a systems map, then you're asking about leverage points, then you actually have to develop a model of how the leverage points will influence the system change or influence and generate the kind of outcomes you care about. You have to theorize, as I said, like how that would happen. And that's what this change model building process is. In what context, through what mechanisms, toward what outcomes. This theory building process becomes key for outcome and impact evaluation, which I'll talk about as well. You can also ask, how do the different actor groups, the different relationships generate system level outcomes? And I'll show you that as an example of that as well. So there's like not a lot, but there are more methods and choices for building change models. And this goes beyond the input, activity, output, outcome model of a logic model, but much more complicated, intertwined models that are still about causal processes, underlying change processes that become theories we can test empirically. In my sort of review, the simple way of doing this is to use some framework for leverage points if you're trying to do system change work. It's about saying, like, what are the types of leverage points? So are you trying to have policy change? Are you trying to influence mental models? This came up in the first talk. You have to really sort of define what are the types of leverage points that you're trying to influence in that system or situation, and then a theory of change methodology, which comes from the evaluation space. These are two guides that really embed systems thinking and methods into the theory of change process. So you can look to some of those, but then they allow you to develop a more detailed model of how change happens, why change happens, for whom. And the change itself is not just about individual behavior change, but rather about changing an aspect or a condition of a system. So together, the leverage points and theory of change sets you up to do that. The one example I'll show briefly is actor-based theory of change. So Drew Colaros's work and John Main's work. Drew's at Mathematica. I think this is really cool work, and there's a lot on this methodology, actor-based theory of change. The reason why I think it's cool is because it's not about looking at an intervention and the activities of the intervention. I know it's small, but on the left, each of those red blobs are different actor groups. So this was in the context, it was in Nepal. It was a program for strengthening security and justice. And they acknowledged that the rates of violence, unreported crime and violence, gender-based violence against women and kids, were not under the control of one group. One intervention could not decrease the rates of unreported crime or decrease the rates of physical violence, right, against women and kids. So what they needed was change within all these different actor groups. They needed the police nationally and at local levels. They needed survivors and advocacy groups, different household groups, different, let's see, I can see friendship and peer groups. There are all these different actors that interact to affect the higher level emergent outcome or pattern having to do with violence. On the right, what you see, so there's a process where you map the actor groups. You think about how those relationships produce the outcomes that you care about at a higher level together. And then for each actor group, for each red box on the left, you actually chart out what they're doing now. What's the current state? What is the future state? And then you theorize in the middle, how do you need to support change within each actor group? And so it's moving from the micro actor level to the higher level system level here, to then affect the overall outcomes at the system level you care about. And this particular methodology uses a combination of capability, opportunity, and motivation as the assumptions about change, like individually and behaviorally. So each actor group needs the capability to act different, they need the opportunity to act different, and they need the motivation. And then together, right, influencing change within each actor group in relation to each other is the system level theory of change to produce those outcomes. So it's just one example of a methodology that brings the leverage points, the change theory of change together, but this doesn't look like a logic model, but it's something that is much more systems informed that then we can test in terms of evaluation. Again, because I tend to talk fast and have a lot of things to say about options, let me pause and give Aisha a chance to respond and interact.
Thank you. And first, I just want to flag how useful I think these options of tools are. And I can completely see how we can use them to engage the different constituents that we work with. But I want to go back to a lot of the questions that are coming up around the approach. Could you give an example from your experience of how we can really engage people that have traditionally held the power in these learning collaboratives, particularly when we want to shift from a single loop learning approach to really a triple loop learning approach. So how have funders, for example, responded to these approaches? Or how have people in government responded to these approaches? And is there an anxiety or a fear that they might not be able to respond to what they're learning from this process?
Yes, very real, very important, and very ongoing conversations in the space. So I want to actually start by saying there's a lot of funder interest. So I named interest from the private foundation space, from the social investment corporate space, and also from the government space. And the reason is because they're ambitious. They want to make sure that their resources investments are being used widely to have the most impact. So if you start there, what do you really care about? Do you really want to affect change in this community, or do you really want to move the needle on this issue? The answer is yes. That's why they're engaged in this type of work in the first place. And then the question is about how do we do that most effectively in a sustained way to maximize impact? You end up getting into the space of systems. Then when you get into the space of systems, you have to ask, why are things the way they are now? Because there is some issue with the way that the system has been designed or the way that it's happening, right? And so often that's inequality, that's injustice, that's built into our systems historically and then currently. So then this sort of depends, right? Sometimes you can frame the engagement in terms of the methods I showed for exploring the situation and systems in a very low stakes way of like, oh, well, we can't understand the system unless we engage different people. It's impossible for us to do this on our own. So it's like you can justify the engagement sometimes from an equitable or participatory stance, and sometimes just from a pragmatic and validity stance. Like we're not going to be able to really understand what's happening unless we engage. So then in doing that, it's completely true that you do have to do some preparation work, some pre-conversations about what that process could elicit. And there's really like some examples of that. Sometimes it's about setting a learning agenda in advance. What are the types of things you want to learn? In my own experience, I mentioned rich pictures and also the different types of systems mapping methods because I found that talking about it is less persuasive than actually just moving through the exercise themselves. So if you actually engage a funder or someone who has more power directly in the process, they end up discovering the insights for themselves that then lead them to ask questions about deeper changes that are needed, which take them into the triple loops learning space. So I guess I'm saying, like, in my experience, I'm not leading with triple loop learning and why we need to interrogate our own mental models, but rather I'm leading with, let's understand the whole system from multiple perspectives. And then when we do that, they end up saying, wow, we have complete, like in the STEM context, oftentimes the local communities surrounding the universities are completely excluded from decision-making processes about STEM. And then they ask, well, why don't we have more local applicants from the local communities? They're not engaged in the higher education institution at all. But instead of me saying that, right, they discover that for themselves in the process.
I think that's such a terrific concrete way of thinking about it, because you're not setting people up to almost be defensive. You're setting people up to be sort of at the table together to figure this out together. And I think that really changes the way the conversation goes forward, which is really important. And then I have a quick question, because I think, I mean, the options that you've given us in terms of potential methods are fantastic. But if we think through them in our table of accountability, learning, and adaptation, do we, as we think about what options are available in terms of methods, how do we start to see the linkage across those different methods as we move from accountability to learning to adaptation? How do we sort of create that thread of what we're learning from one method to the next that helps us, you know, unpack each of these three areas?
Yeah, that's great. Again, I think also with time, I'm going to answer that as I talk about some of the other options because it's even more evident in those. The first two I showed were sort of more exploratory, so they could be learning primarily about what's happening and what needs to change and how to design the change process. But the next ones are going to focus much more on things that are aligned with accountability and also with adaptation.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for lifting up questions from the chat as well. I am aware of our time. I'm going to keep this pretty high level. I want to say first, in terms of outcomes and impacts, that this is a very rich space. There's a lot of great work on reinventing impact evaluation using non-experimental designs. I'm going to show you some of that, but we can still look at outcomes and impacts in terms of systemic change and take a systemic orientation to looking at outcomes and impacts, but it does look a little different methodologically. So oftentimes when we think about outcome and impact, it's through an attribution lens where we're asking questions: what works? What difference did the intervention make? So if you've seen this image or not, you see some people in a room with A points to B, right? Intervention points to results. And they're in their box that sort of ruled out and ignored all these interrelated factors outside that might be affecting A to B. And there's someone opening the door saying, isn't this a big set of assumptions in terms of focusing just on what works and the difference the intervention makes? In the systemic change or systems and complexity informed evaluation space, we use the word contribution a lot. We're not really interested primarily in attribution. We know how to do that in terms of causal inference using experiments and quasi-experiments through the social sciences. That's about attribution. Let's leave that there. The systems and complexity informed is about contribution. How did the intervention make a difference? For whom? In what circumstances? So acknowledging some of those internal and external factors. What initiatives or factors, conditions together contribute? So how do multiple interventions work together? And then how do participants narrate their experience and changes? Those are all types of questions that can use contribution assumptions about outcomes and impact and have methods that go with them. So I'm acknowledging like the predominance of experiments and quasi-experiments in terms of attribution-based causal inferences and claims. With our time, I won't be able to go into each of these in a lot of depth, but the method options really are in three clusters, the way I see them. There are theory-based methods, and those are listed underneath. These are about understanding the how and the why and the what context, that change process. There are some in the bottom called configurational. Qualitative comparative analysis is one. This is about looking at the connection between different interventions. And then the third one is about participant stories. And this is really about harvesting, listening to direct stories of change. So I know some of you are going to want a lot more on this. I'm happy to geek out on it and talk about it outside of this, but given this is a helicopter talk and we're doing an overview and where we are, I just want to give you a flavor that there's a lot out there to sort of expand the way that we do outcome and impact evaluation. Yes, and this is a whole masterclass if you just did this one. So one example, this is the significant instances of policy and systems improvement. So what this group did, and you can see their SIPC technique, they combined participant stories with contribution analysis. So they did a bottom-up process of gathering stories of change and then analyzing those stories in relation to how a set of interventions could have contributed to those changes. So they're interested in sort of contributory claims about the relationship between the changes and the interventions. If you dig into this one, which is in the link, it's for a community maternal and child health hub. There's like, I think over 30 sites that were supposed to come together to all serve this multiple communities of women in terms of maternal and then early child, right? Infant care and health. And then what they did is they listened for stories of change that overlapped with different types of policy and systems change. They have a systematic process for analyzing those. And then they have another systematic process for actually labeling them, the outcome domain and the degree of significance. And so it is interpretive, but in that interpretive process, they're also labeling the degree of evidence that supports the link between what the intervention was and did and the claims that are made in the stories. So it sort of mixes a couple of different ideas to think about how do we make claims about systems impact in a systematic way, but also in a way that honors like the stories and the diversity of stories in terms of change. So that's one in the outcomes and impact space. There are a lot more, and these resources on the bottom are places to look. There's tons that the evaluation field has developed that is informed by some of the systems assumptions. The two other that I'm just going to name, which sort of are at the edge of the systems field as well, future scenarios. So I mentioned at the beginning that when we're engaged in a change in evaluation process, we also have to look outward and forward, right? In terms of what is unfolding, particularly from that adaptation purpose. So how do we think about future scenarios? There's great work in the strategic foresight and futures space. This is the cone of possibilities, one of the futures cones. You can see that when we look out and forward, there's different types of futures that we can both anticipate and then imagine. Possible, preferred, probable, plausible. There are different definitions of these. And here are some of the questions we could ask, right? Like, what are possible versus preferred futures? How could we shift? How should the future scenarios that might play out change what we do, right? How do we anticipate what might happen? Think about whether it's good, bad, or how it might interact with what we're doing now or could do, and then think strategically about our change process or even what our evaluation looks at by folding in that futures knowledge. Again, there's so much great work happening here in terms of method options. So these are some links. Some of them are from government, some of them are from NGOs that organize all the types of future tools that you can pull on to do this type of work, if this is what your sort of primary question is. And back to Aisha's point, like, this is really tied to adaptation. I don't see how we can adapt if we're not like engaging some of these future methods, or how we can support adaptation. There's one example here. I won't be able to go into it with our time, but you can look at it on the slide later. Basically, there's a way of identifying some of the uncertainties that might be critical in relation to what you're working on, and then to develop these kind of scenario matrices, which you see on the right, that intersect axes of different types of uncertainties, and then think through what that scenario might mean for your work. That's just one. Again, it's quite simple in terms of the amount of time it takes, but it can really expand a group's thinking about how the future might unfold and how that might affect their understanding or their change effort. I know there's a lot, but again, this was to give you a sense of breadth and possibility. So the culminating one, multidimensional value and evaluation, this is what most of you wanted to know from the beginning. How do we assess change at a systems level, or how do we measure systems impact or systems change, right? That gets to like overall, what's the value in terms of a contribution of a set of initiatives or interventions to the system or to the change in the system. So it could be about what multidimensional value do our efforts bring? How can we develop the value proposition of our work to make a case that our work has higher or broader changes? Also, what are the risks and negative consequences, and how do we mitigate them? In terms of value-based methodologies, most of these come from evaluation, although critical systems heuristics is covered in this masterclass as well. I'm going to actually have to skip this. But what I want to point out is that these methods move from this left to the right. They move from us saying if something works based on what evidence to having a much more participatory deliberative process where we're negotiating ideas about what value means, and we're using evidence to inform those negotiations and discussions. But it's a much more collaborative idea of how do we assess value. And this is something to dig into if you're already here. I intentionally put it at the end because we usually want to go there first, but none of the other work has been done. But there's a lot of different types of evaluative rubrics. This one by the Louds Foundation is great. And for each one of these areas, you can click on it and they'll have like their criteria, how they operationalize it, and what are the indicators. And they have criteria around, is the system changing? But they went through a lengthy process to develop this rubric. And so it's a really good resource and it's flexible. It could adapt to your context. But this is a way of operationalizing what value means, then linking indicators and measures to it. But my point in putting it at the end here is because we can't expect to have systemic change if we haven't done the work of actually designing and moving through a systemic change process. But in terms of systems evaluation, I think this is sort of like the culmination, which is why it was at the top of the pyramid as well. And with that, I'm going to close out, because if you were doing the evaluation planning tool, like this is resources that you can look at me go back a little bit, but this is the list of resources you can use later. And the idea is like, not that you would do everything, right? You would think about what is the row that I want to hone in on and explore more. And in the masterclass series, there's a lot of, there's some of these covered. So you can also attend those and engage with those sessions to learn more about the specific method or application. My contact information is in the slide. I'm happy to engage with you, so feel free to email me if you have questions or want to interact outside of this talk. Thank you for your attention. I know, again, it was a lot. As I said, my goal is to give you breadth and possibility.
Thank you, Emily. And what I can see, you've definitely generated a lot of continued excitement about the masterclass series. And we know we're at the start of this journey. There's a lot more to explore, but you've given us the options. And I just wonder if there's one thing, like any kind of key advice, as many of us, including myself, are novices in trying to change the way we think about evaluation. What do you think is an important sort of piece of advice as we start on this learning journey, and how to approach subsequent masterclasses as well? Are there things we should hold in our minds about what the possibilities are?
Yeah, I love that question. And I think you almost answered it implicitly. So I would say like sort of a mix of humility and competence or confidence. So I want my message to be like, let's be humble, because actually there's a wealth of knowledge, both lived experience knowledge, right? People who are directly affected that they have. Sometimes people are quite natural systems thinkers. They have rich information that can get folded into the process, but there's a lot of expertise as well in terms of methods and in terms of discipline, right? That we need to expand. So that kind of humility. But also my message is not that like we have to throw things out. We bring a lot to the table that can be woven in. And so like having a sense of like, even if this feels overwhelming or there's a lot of new stuff, whatever your expertise, right, and experience already is, there's going to be a place for it and it's going to be needed within a systemic change process, because it's about bringing those things together.
Thank you. That's such a good message to end on.
Well, wow, I think we're all speechless, Emily and Aisha. Thank you so much. And what a great start to day one. I want to tell colleagues, I know I'm overwhelmed after these 4 hours of like such rich sessions, but the reason we did the masterclass is so condensed and close together in 2 weeks, because we wanted the information to stay fresh and carry on and build upon each other. So using a lot of adult learning principles. So stick in there, come on this journey with us, attend the sessions every day. I think it's always more exciting live. You can of course catch the recordings. Everything will be shared. Everything will be on the website. So don't worry about it. But just really quickly, again, a reminder, if you want a certificate, please complete the short survey. Shreya has been sharing it throughout. Encourage you to do it right away while all the information is fresh. The more details you give us, the better it helps us plan for future masterclass series. So thank you for doing that. If you want more information on systems learning and early childhood stuff, you can go to ECDAN's website. We have a thematic page there. We've been encouraging people to connect on the ECD Connect platform. A lot of people have signed up. We'll do community approvals pretty quickly, so you'll be able to go on there. And this is a moment to grab all the things from the presentations and unpack it, and then we'll have the systems experts also go in there and answer questions over the next couple of weeks that we have the master classes going. So this is your time to get live responses as well. And a reminder, we have 2 sessions upcoming tomorrow. One with Bob Williams, again, a global expert in systems thinking, and another with Aaron Watson. A lot of the stuff that Emily has been referencing today. And please share the links widely with your networks. We want to try to benefit as many people as possible and spread the gospel of systems thinking as far and wide. So please, it's completely free, so share widely. And finally, I just want to thank again the ECDAN team that's been behind pulling all this together. Shreya, Hannah, Carol, Catherine, a lot of behind the scenes work. So big thank you to everyone. All right, with that, we have 1 minute left. Any last words, Emily and Aisha? Emily, there are like 30 questions in the Q&A that people are really asking. I think there was one question that I would be really keen on, and Emily, if I can find it, I think I sent it to you, Aisha. I think there was, okay, so Great. So you've answered in the chat about an example of how a funder can engage in triple loop learning. You said check out Julia Kaufman's series. She'll be part of the series. Is there anything in there that pops up for you, Emily, that you'd like to take this last 30 seconds to respond to?
I'll just echo the same point about the humility and the competence. Like there's a lot of work happening with funders. Sometimes as researchers and evaluators, we feel like we're just going to be going upstream, like against the current in proposing and doing this work. As the beginning of the talk, I showed you some of the calls and demand. I actually think the circumstances around our work are shifting. There are going to be more opportunities. There's going to be more synergies. So I don't necessarily say expect resistance from funders or those in sort of more powerful positions. I think people are asking for it in more spaces. There are more examples of it you can share. And yes, most of the sessions are on specific methods, but the one with Julia Kaufman from Center for Evaluation Innovation, there are examples from philanthropy in particular about how you do this work directly with funders. And so that's there, that's available as a resource, but I want to sort of expand the idea like we might encounter resistance. Like I actually think that there's more support and synergy, especially if we sort of background the jargon and foreground the let's have more impact and how do we do this together. I think there's a lot of demand for that.
Amazing. So with that, thank you so much, everyone. Ian, I see your question about a link to Bob one. Everything is on the Masterclass website. You can find all of them there. So I'll just put that there. But thanks, everyone. Day one was a smashing success and looking forward to the rest of the days. And I hope all of you keep showing up and bring your friends and family along as well. All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Emily, thank you.
Yeah, I was gonna say I can stand for a minute. I know Aisha has to go, but thank